Cell phones go off yesterday, so I'd like to make one reminder. Could you please turn off your cell phones if you have one? Thank you. Also, there will be a little book signing afterwards. I think most of the authors are still here from yesterday, too, so if you missed one of those, they should be available to sign. In the panel this afternoon, we'll have just the speakers that are on today, just like in yesterday's panel we had just those speakers. But the others should be around. And we also have some DVDs and recordings available. That's what they've been doing up here, and they've promised, there she is, a pretty quick turnaround time. So most of the talks should be available on either CD or DVD. And we're waiting for one more light here. But our first speaker this morning is a friend I've known for 10 years or so. He's a really remarkable physicist. It's okay. In that he studies ancient history and ancient technologies, and has been looking at modern physics and trying to tie the two together a little bit. And also, where we left things yesterday, before the bonus presentation, was there's this possibility we're in a binary system, and that might be the driving mechanism for the rise and fall of the ages. John will get into the point that if we are in a binary system, what effects might actually be taking place to affect consciousness, the magnetosphere, the ionosphere, and that sort of thing. So he's a really, really cool guy. Will you please welcome John Daring?
Can anybody hear me okay? No? All right, how about now? All right, good. By the way, I'm the kid that was always getting his homework done at the last minute. So we got these charts sent to Jeff. What was it, Jeff? I think after midnight last night. So it's kind of in keeping with the long tradition, you know. I thought I would start off this presentation by first kind of indicating that we're going to have quite a bit to talk about. And I have another unique approach. I put slides up and then I talk about something completely different. So it kind of makes it, and it's really interesting on when they record this on the DVD, because then, you know, you sort of are trying to figure out what it is about that slide that's causing them to say things like that. But basically what I'm going to talk about in brief is the fact that, you know, we're in a binary orbit, and there's some very strong indication of that. It's alluded to, mentioned directly in some cases in the ancient writings. There's some astronomical evidence, and I think there's at least one test that I've talked over briefly with Richard that I think would be definitive. Well, I'll mention that at the end of my presentation. But at any rate, there's a lot to cover because, okay, a binary orbit is one thing, but it doesn't have anything, in my opinion, to do with this rise and fall of ages. There's got to be some other mechanism going on, and the ancients provide a suggestion, a clue, which is that there's a third object, but then this gets into all kinds of things about how much the ancients might have known about physics and electromagnetism, because they allude to the fact the reason the ages are occurring is something to do with electromagnetism. And there's basically a lot of physics, astronomy, even some engineering that we have to get into. And some of the other speakers, you may have noticed yesterday, were grumbling a little bit about the 45-minute thing, and I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to let someone very famous sum it up for me. But you know, I just realized the slides are showing here. I was trying to read the little thumbnail thing here, and that's really good. This is really a nice nice place here. Well, basically, look, the binary orbit by itself, to just kind of remind everybody, what that means is that our sun and another star And that star could be an exotic object. It could be something even like an old neutron star, which is effectively going to be very difficult to detect other than by its gravitational presence. But this other star and our sun are in a binary orbit, and it's kind of, Walter had that beautiful animation. I'm not going to try, last year I was doing a lot of this, trying to explain this stuff. But basically, the two stars go around each other in an orbit. And that by itself is a major revelation in astrophysics, astronomy, and planetary physics if that turns out to be correct. But it cannot, in my opinion, easily account for why there is this periodic rise and fall of ages. There's got to be some other influence going on here. And so the first thing I'm going to do, and this is absolutely not in any way disagreeing with our speakers such as Dr. Schock yesterday, I'm simply going to say that while I believe the binary orbit might act as a trigger for geophysical processes, some of you may have heard of a theory called nemesis, which says that our sun is in a very long period binary orbit. In the nemesis model, it's on the order of tens of millions of years. But the idea is kind of along the lines of what I'm going to mention here, and that would be that this orbit somehow periodically triggers, for example, a wave of massive bombardment by comets and other planetary or space debris, and those come crashing in, and whatever level of civilization human beings have reached gets clobbered. Everything is set back. We probably go through some very rough times as we try to recoup, and then after the orbital conditions are more favorable, civilization is rising up again, and all of those other things are nice legends. And that's probably undoubtedly something that does go on, even if these events are not timed or triggered or enhanced by that orbit. That is definitely part of it. But I don't believe that's the entire picture, because one of the things is that if you read the ancients, and part of this conference is really that we're listening to our ancestors speak. We're not just discounting everything and saying, that's in the past, that's primitive, they didn't have science. I have a major disagreement with those that say they didn't have science. All of the indication is they did. But they don't describe it in terms of catastrophism. They do indicate that there were these cataclysmic events, such as the fable that has come down to us, or the myth about the destruction of Atlantis and other civilizations. But there's something else going on here, and one of the indications is that you read what the ancients have to say, and they're talking about this almost like the party's over. They're describing it like this malaise that's creeping in, this sense of sadness, that this subtle, wonderful, divine influence is slowly leaving them. It's actually a little bit like that feeling of coming down, on Monday or Sunday morning or whenever your favorite night of the week is, and all of that good feeling is leaving you. And you know that now it's going to be that grim Monday morning reality. It's that kind of feeling, and that's basically what you see. And in fact, if you look at some of the changes in sculpture, you'll notice something else. There's a kind of a nobility and spirituality that shows up in many of the really ancient cultures in their artwork, in their carvings. And as we get into even Greece, which we consider to be a very magnificent civilization, and the later dynasties in Egypt, there is this kind of sadness that you see in their face. It's actually like they know that this is ending. They know that they're approaching this night. And last year, I'm not going to go through it this year, but last year I talked quite a bit in my intro about the Kalevala epic. This is a tradition from basically Northern Europe, Finland, that in many scholars' estimates is probably comparable now in significance in one of these great world myths to the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Mahabharata and Ramayana of ancient India. It's a profound and powerful, and it is very clearly about the world ages. And it is very clearly mentions a dual companion and a third object. And that's, again, and the book of Daniel was another one. And if you can remember that vision as this magnificent statue progressively getting more and more kind of degraded and corrupted as they go lower. So the ancients talk about this third object, and they say that Unfortunately, a lot of this stuff was put into rather poetic terms, because that seems to be a great way to preserve knowledge. But also, during the Dark Ages, there's a remarkable tendency for people to decide they're going to kind of expound and recopy and all of this. And the ancient Hindus were really marvelous at, in many ways, being the best at preserving the ancient records. But they kind of go overboard. You know, if you've ever seen a lot of the Vedic texts, they get to, you know, they'll say something like this particular level of whatever it is. You know, I've been reading the Vimana Shastra, and they talk about, you know, a particular type of cloud that would be of concern to pilots of Vimanas. And they talk about the 32 different types of clouds within that particular family, and it just goes, and finally it's just thousands of volumes of this stuff. And so basically we were fortunate in that Sri Yukteswar and others have really cleared away a lot of that. And basically what it comes down to is the way the binary cycle is described in relation to this great year is there is an orbit that our sun is involved in. It's approximately 24,000 years in some systems, 26,000 years in other. And as the sun is brought in towards this object, we're immersed in some type of a field that progressively, generation over generation, because this is occurring over thousands of years, elevates, raises, awakens, whatever term you want to use, the capacity or potential for human awareness and expression. And then, as we're receding from that grand center, it basically goes downhill. And the two are obviously not perfectly symmetric, because in one case you're starting from not much and going upwards, and in the other case you're starting from a very high level and coming down. So there's a kind of an interesting asymmetry that's in there, which I've been doing quite a bit of thinking about, actually, just of recently. The third object is clearly something unusual. It's energetic. It's a source of a very intense field. Therefore, it is not an ordinary star. It is probably something that, I don't know if they even use this term anymore, but I like it, HEAO, high energy astronomical object. An object, you know, we hear about these, you know, the exciting ones, the ones that a lot of people take freshman astronomy for, because they, you know, who cares about the lunar cycle? You want to hear about black holes and neutron stars and all that stuff. And this field somehow regulates the capacity of awareness. Now that's an interesting concept right there, because the idea that electromagnetism really has much of anything to do with human life is still a, to put it mildly, a controversial idea. It's really only recently that there is now an official mainstream, reputable, you know, okay to publish in journal of bioelectromagnetics within the last few years. Three-body concept. I'm going to skip through some of these charts because I have, you know, basically a limited time and 72 charts. But the idea basically is that, yeah, and the good ones, you know, come. But anyway, the idea is that, look, we're in this orbit. We're getting close to this object that in the ancient Vedic text is called Vishnu Nabi. That's an interesting word. Vishnu is the preservative aspect of creation, spirit and creation. Kind of suggestive that this is sort of sustaining, keeping things going. They describe it as the universal magnetism. And I'm going to, for the time being, we're just going to think of magnetism and electromagnetism, but in the back of your mind, keep something there. Remember that it is not electromagnetism, but it is described as something more fundamental, more subtle, something that underlies electromagnetic phenomena, and by the way, other types of fundamental forces. And at the very end of my talk, I'm going to show you something I've been working on. It's quite interesting. In order to kind of help get a sample or a feeling of this, I thought I asked an artist friend of mine who's also a mechanical engineer from MIT to kind of do some illustrations for this presentation, and she wasn't able to be here today, but you know, I really would like to thank Angie Bamblett, and I'll give you an example here that I think can kind of help us, and it's from something, this is to sort of get us into thinking about our binary orbit and this grand center or third object. And it involves a road trip, which in this case, it's not a very interesting road trip. This car is doomed to drive around this elliptical racetrack for eternity. But as it's getting close to the hills over there, you'll notice there's this big radio transmitter that's broadcasting music, and the car gets closer to it and the reception gets better. And then as the car gets further away, it's not a very exciting example, but you get the idea, I think, that it's a source sending out this electromagnetic energy, we get closer to it, better reception, further away. Well, let's kind of put, by the way, notice a little bit about the rocks, because you'll notice I'm showing the radio waves kind of scattering. You've seen that or heard that phenomena when you're driving, listening to a station, and you're maybe in the desert, and you'll find zones where the reception's pretty good, but then you'll hear kind of that, sort of sound as you're going through. You're actually passing through interference zones, diffraction zones, where the waves are skipping over the rough surface terrain and interfering with each other. Let's make it a little bit closer to the Yuga cycle. Now it's no longer radio reception. Now that's a master transmitter, and it's sending out timing pulses for a computer that happens to be on this car. And so the computer, when it's here at the furthest away point, doesn't always get the timing pulses, so it tends to lock up. And this is even, in addition to what it does having Microsoft products on it, so it basically, it doesn't work too well. So about, the only thing it can do is 2 plus 2, because any of the longer calculations are going to unfortunately get interrupted. So it's in a very limited capacity. And then as it swings in closer to this radio transmitter, it's getting a stronger signal. And so now you've kind of got the idea going here. So now I'm going to give it one more slight twist. It's no longer a radio station. It's a large electromagnet. And inside that computer, the processor chip requires being immersed in a magnetic field. I asked Angie to show the processor board and find some way to show that when it's in a strong magnetic field, it processes better. And she said, get real. So at any rate, that's where we're at that. But you get the idea. So that's kind of where we're going. So we've introduced this third body concept, and to kind of give you a sense of sort of from an orbital thing, I'll use some slides I had from last year. So basically, our orbit is the one over on the right-hand side. Not a very exciting piece of art, but here's this mystery object, and you may note that I'm trying to indicate a magnetic field of some sort. And we're getting drawn in towards that as part of our orbit, and that is at our furthest point, that's the dark ages. And then when we get a little closer, we get our closest actually. That yellow dot, by the way, represents our sun and all of the planets. Obviously, this isn't even remotely to scale, so this is just a cartoon. And we get very close to it. We're now immersed in the field more fully, and consciousness is doing well because our computer is working better. And then we can kind of take a look at about where we are. And it's pretty grim, because really the truth is, a lot of people say, oh, we're going into a new age. Yes, we are, but it's not the smoothest age, by the way, if you read those old texts. It's actually a rough ride ahead, folks. So let's kind of take a look at this concept here a little bit. We get drawn in close. Here's the binary orbit up there, and we're getting drawn into this grand center. Now, this is Angie's art, which is why it looks nice. And the brains, the human brains, are in some way like that processor. They're responding to this field, and over here we have this kind of mental awareness chart, of which I'm going to avoid hitting the doom button here. So basically, as we're getting pulled in, our solar system, getting immersed in that field, awareness is very high, and then it falls down. There's the dark age right there, the bottom of the cycle, around 500 AD, and then we're swinging up again as we're getting further immersed in that field. Now, this is basically the ancient Hindu concept right here. And it is also alluded to in many other cultures, but the Hindus in particular were very good at preserving the mathematical structure and giving a little bit more of what I would consider to be kernels that we could associate with physics. And so we have this idea that, look, our orbit here, on this part of the cycle, we're climbing up. This isn't quite, didn't come out quite the way I wanted it to, but you get the idea. And then on this part of the orbit, when we're receding from the grand center, things are falling back down. And this cycle, of course, just would reflect over on itself, and therefore we'd get this kind of a sinusoidal waveform. And it's not actually a sinusoid, it's a curtate cycloid, if you want to know the exact form of it, but that doesn't really matter. So That's basically the yuga concept, but we need to look at an area here. And I'm going to skip through several charts, but basically what we're going to start talking about now is, okay, that's the concept. Great. How do electromagnetic fields have any possible influence on human consciousness? And then we're going to talk a little bit about, well, maybe what the grand center might be and what we might find out about some of the ancient sites. So bioelectromagnetic effects, very controversial area. It is hard to believe that it is only recently that you can talk to what I consider to be mainstream academic physicists and express the idea that electromagnetic fields can exert a profound effect on human consciousness, can basically, you know, if you will, upset the brain or beneficially cause calm states, even enhanced performance. I will not go into some of the stuff that I'm aware of because some of you know what I do for a living. I will allude to the fact that while the mainstream academic communities had a hard time swallowing that, I assure you, your happy Department of Defense has been well aware of some of this for a number of years. And just we'll leave it at that. And other countries have as well. And I might add one other thing too. They look at these ancient things. I have. That's where I've gotten some of my most interesting ideas for that type of work. So basically, there's a history here. I'll skip through this pretty quickly. Benjamin Franklin was the first to show sort of brain-type effects. He dragged an electrified chain across his forehead, and the periodic current produced by the links dragging over produced this kind of psychedelic light show in his head, which are known as Purkinje forms. These type of hallucinations, psychedelic experiences are sometimes noted by people who build Tesla coils. When they're using what's called a rotary spark gap, when the spark gap is synced up to frequencies which relate to brain rates. Some people suggest those aren't just hallucinations, and I think that's a very interesting area to consider, that we may actually be seeing things that are there but normally not easily perceived. Plants, this is an area I'm going to talk a little bit about because it actually has an implication that goes a lot deeper. Simon Limstrom did this interesting experiment back in the 1880s where he said, you know what, I'm going to find out why plants seem to grow so well when there's a lot of aurora borealis activity. And what he found was that there is kind of a night cycle growth that in the northern latitudes, he actually found plants were growing at night. They had a day cycle and a night cycle. To this day, I don't know that anybody has gone back and seriously looked at that in the biology community. But what he did see, though, was he was the first to kind of note that there was something related to a cycle. He had a vegetable garden growing here, which I guess Angie showed us as flowers, but you get the idea, basically. And he was putting a high-voltage grid over it. He had a really interesting old die rod type of high-voltage generator. And he was trying to mimic the telluric and ionic currents that are seen during the peak auroral activities. And he noted that plant growth, crop yields in certain northern latitude countries actually tended to follow the auroral activity, which of course we now understand. It was a little bit suspected perhaps then, but we now know it's linked to the sunspot cycle. So there's an example of a kind of a biological system which is going up and down with an astrophysical process, not an orbit-related one, but nevertheless you kind of get the idea, and it's an electromagnetic process as well. And Bose, of course, the great scientist from India, did this remarkable series of experiments. Really, just, you know, a lot of people talk about Tesla being ahead of his time. Bose, this guy, unbelievable. He was doing, if any of you are electrical engineers, 60 gigahertz millimeter wave experiments in the 1890s. And to this day, I've looked at some of his apparatus, and I think, you know, I mean, my job is we try to make things very powerful because we want to project very intense beams, and I see some potential merits in that. And he was finding out that biological materials had here's a bundle of jute. This thing is a nonlinear quarter wave plate. So basically what he found was that plant material could act as a guide for trapping and enhancing or localizing electromagnetic energy. Nikola Tesla, same thing. You probably know he talked a lot about electronarcosis, basically the inducing sort of narcotic-like states in the brain. The Soviet during the Cold War. This is really what got the U.S. interested, was we kept getting these reports that the Russians were doing all this marvelous work with electromagnetism. There's a sad story involved in that, which I'll just briefly mention. You know that horrible musical instrument called the theremin? You know, where you slide your hand up and down that electrically charged pole? It's actually a radio frequency transmission line, and it's a heterodyne. Basically, it's a horrible instrument. It just sounds awful. But anyway, the guy that invented that and his wife used to tour around New York City, and he was abducted by the NKVD, the old Soviet KGB, and taken to Russia in 1945 to work on radio wave weapons, and not reunited with his wife until they were both in their 90s. It's a very sad story. But at any rate, what I consider the most significant work is Richard Dickow, and he's really unsung. He did a series of experiments where he looked at pulsed magnetic fields, and the reason I like his work is the darn fields he was looking at are weak. 10 to the minus 5 Gauss. In fact, they went weaker. And what he found was that if you got these fields at the right pulse rate, and particularly with the right rise time and pulse width, you could cause the brain of test animals like rhesus monkeys to lock up on that frequency for 36 hours when there was only a 20-minute exposure. More recent work that's been done with hamsters has suggested that hamsters which are exposed to low-frequency modulated ELF fields of the right frequency, their brain actually appears to be getting a benefit that is passed on from generation to generation. And those that are deprived of it, or perhaps a better way of saying it, those that are fed the wrong type of magnetic condition, that is passed on. So this might be a kind of a model for what's going on with the ages. A lot of different types of interactions. I'm just going to briefly say that if you're wondering, well, how, is it just an issue of getting closer? Possibly. Possibly it's an issue of getting closer and moving faster relative to the grand center. And then, of course, there may be additional effects because maybe the grand center is one of these objects that sends out pulses, and we're actually getting a little bit of a Doppler shift, which is tuning us better into that curve of the grand center. Altered states of awareness, we mentioned this yesterday. Persinger's work with the alleged UFO encounters around some geophysical zones. Interesting story about the UFO sightings that were occurring in the Yakima Indian Reservation. One thing I would mention also is Valerie Hunt at UCLA built a chamber in which she screened out all of the ambient DC electric, magnetic, and low-frequency ELF fields that are naturally present on our planet. Make a long story short, people don't know what's going on in there. They're asked to perform tests, simple cognitive functions. And what they find is, deprived of those fields, their performance statistically went down substantially. When the fields were restored to normal conditions, performance was restored. When the fields were enhanced above levels which currently can exist on our planet, the performance went up. And some people reported euphoric states and even, well, what are we going to say, spiritual or spiritual type feelings perhaps, psychic type feelings might be another one. The concept that I'm going to allude to with that is this. The planet is and this goes back to Tesla and Lord Kelvin. The planet acts as an electromagnetic resonator. So one of the questions that I've had is, oh, okay, great, so there's this object, who knows what it could be, maybe a magnetar. I don't know of any nearby magnetars, nearby meaning within 1,000 light years, but let's just take an example nevertheless. How is an object even that powerful, that far away, going to produce these sort of effects? Because it's one thing to say, wow, 10 to the minus 5 Teslas, not a very big field, but nevertheless, below the Earth field. In fact, I take that back. It's 10 to the minus 5 below the Earth's ambient field. It's 10 to the minus, it's a 100,000th of a Gauss, which is the Earth field, is capable of doing this at the right pulse frequency. The Sun, the magnetosphere of the Earth, perhaps Jupiter, other planets in our solar system have complex plasma systems. Number one, we have a larger capture area than we might think. It isn't just the size of my head that has to try and capture this energy from deep space. This entire solar system is a plasma structure that can, in a way, act like an antenna, and it's immense. In addition, within that antenna is the planet Earth, which we have seen in NASA data, and also as predicted by Nikola Tesla, and I might add, measured by my colleagues and I at SARA. There are electromagnetic resonances on this planet in addition to the Schumann resonances. The Schumann resonances a lot of people in the New Age community like to talk about. The other resonances are actually of more interest because they're high Q. That means the Earth can store the energy for many, many, many oscillation cycles, build it up to an average intensity that can be perhaps 1,000 times above what it would be just if it was the field coming in straight from space. And so we get this intense electromagnetic field building up. Intense meaning intense enough for our brain to interact with it. So you basically have a distant source, but a very large capture system. This is a speculation, but I ran through and did some back-of-the-envelope numbers. And if we had a magnetar within 10 to 100 light years, it would be sufficient to create those Richard Dickhout type field levels. Now, I don't think there is one. But it's an example, though, and remember, I'm going to come back at the very end of my talk and talk a little bit about some of these other conditions that may apply to that so-called universal magnetism. There are, for example, a variety of other types of modes, the alpha waves. I won't go into this. Basically, our planet is alive with a kind of an electromagnetic symphony of resonances. They're all down typically in the extremely low and ultra-low frequency bands. By the way, if there's any engineers here, yes, ULF is technically a correct term. It's actually sub-VLF, or sub-ELF, excuse me. And we therefore have the possibility that when we talk about electromagnetic waves from space interacting with the human brain, interacting with all of us right here, it's a little more than just our brains trying to pick up a signal from a distant star. This may also explain why certain sacred sites, for example, do have that effect, because they are local points for field enhancement in this world oscillation structure. Now, Earth resonance, of course, is a direction I've just alluded to. I will mention one other thing, too. There are probably some implications for this that some of you are going to start speculating about, and I would like to point a few things out. Please don't start getting off into the mind control concept, because it turns out that when these fields are used to stimulate the brain, it's a little bit more like trying to, I don't want to necessarily use the psychedelic drug analogy, but why not? It's like when the U.S. Army used to try and give LSD to soldiers to find out what would happen, and the soldiers would just start laughing at people giving them orders. A lot of people come up with these grim conspiracies about, oh, they're going to build radio stations and broadcast these wavelengths and just control the world population. Why would they need to do that? They've got television. I mean, that's, you know, I mean, that's... So, when your brain is working better, I got news for you, you're not that easy to control. Think about that, okay? You know, and if you're going to basically destroy people's brains, then it's a whole different type of electromagnetic weapon. But this idea, the Russians were trying that, and guess what? It didn't work. So try not to get too freaked out when you hear some of this stuff. I'd like to also, at this point, kind of allude to a little bit of some work going back to plants, because I really like talking about plants. There's a very, very humble man named Mike Topin, and he lives in Michigan, and he's been doing a kind of an updated Lemstrom experiment, high voltage, and he's been taking the plants up to higher voltages than Lemstrom would have considered. I also allude to the fact that our own USDA has looked at magnetic fields for this type of work as well. Well, here is his Cockcroft-Walton voltage multiplier. I just told him I'd put this in there. Here it is. Simple guy. Got this idea. I'm going to tell you where he got this idea, though. He was unaware anybody had done it. All of the plants you see on the right-hand side were treated. The ones on the left are not receiving high voltage. This is his grandsons are next to the untreated plants here. This is for real. And here, look at this, you know. And I show these photos. And, you know, this is his idea, basically, of how you do science. You know, it's like you just put your grandson next to it. But it's a really remarkable story, the work he's done. And he was kind of a little bit too humble. He didn't even want me to mention his name. But he's done such remarkable work because he got this idea from the Bible. And this is not to push some kind of religious thing, because I know we all have that issue, But the thing is, it's very interesting. He was reading it and he goes, they talk about different weather conditions after the flood. And so he got the idea that, well, maybe closer to a paradise-like time on Earth, there was a larger electric field. And so he started playing around with that as an idea for how you might produce food for growing, for dealing with the world population. It's a very interesting story. Some conclusions so far. This is the one that, actually, this last bullet, number 4, is the one I really want to get to. All right, geophysical resonances, yeah, that's really important too, but number 4, these plants, they really respond well to that, and we heard that yesterday too. Particularly in relation to those ancient sites, I found that fascinating. Plants are looking for this. If they're looking for it, chances are they have evolved to expect this. If you go back to the Hindu cycle, it says we spend 70%, and in fact, if you count really the higher part of the Dwapara Yuga, we spend more like 80% of our time in this higher age, high field condition. Therefore, it is more normal to be in an intense field than it is to be in a low field like we are now. Field meaning whatever this mystery field is. The plants are expecting that. It's like when they finally get a dose of the proper nutrients, or you take a population of people that have been deprived of vitamins, and then you introduce vitamins and you see this sudden burst of growth and health showing up. Basically, what the plants may be telling us is this is normally what they would consider to be normal. Implications for the great year, we require this. This is our normal condition on this planet. The dark ages don't last that long. And therefore, they'd say this is kind of the exception. It's the exception, or the less common part of the cycle. Statistically, it's more likely you're going to be in the higher ages, and us lucky folks get to be down in this place, So, now, this one is kind of the closest I'm going to get to making a political comment, but I think it's interesting. People don't like being talked about like they're things, but we're about to do that here. If you talk about this universal magnetism as if it is a type of a magnetism, well, in physics and engineering, we know about these ways that materials interact with magnetic fields. And I thought I'd take a look at those and say, there's a kind of some odd stuff that looks like it might relate to this Yuga cycle, or the cycle of the great year, this 24,000-year cycle. And I mentioned this last year, but I'm going to jump ahead to the artwork. Basically, Barkhausen effect. Let me just kind of show you what I mean. All right, down here in the left-hand corner, I've got a picture. There's a piece of magnetic material, like a ferrite or who knows what, getting swung around on this racetrack, and there's an electromagnet over there on the right. And so this ferrite comes in closer to the field, and then it's moving away. And this is probably not the way you would actually do it in a physics lab. You would generally just put the material in one spot and then turn the magnetic field up and down. But I think the idea is about the same. The way that material, what's going on in that material, responds to the magnetic field is kind of interesting. So remember, the thing I'm sort of trying to model here, I'm using this block of material whizzing around here into this magnetic field to basically simulate this cycle. All right? The idea being that cycle is resulting from this orbit, which is taking us close to this object, this mysterious grand center. So, kind of think about what it is. Now, what happens? Well, let's look over here. Hysteresis. What is hysteresis? You can kind of think of it as magnetic inertia. You do all that work to polarize the magnetic domains in the material, and now it wants to stay there. So what does this suggest? Well, in a weird way, it suggests that coming down out of the higher ages, there's a tendency for things to stay better longer. You might say that we remain polarized a little bit longer. The field, the residual field on the Earth, in this strange, mysterious kind of psychic magnetism, whatever, remains locked up. People's brains are in that state longer. And therefore, the ideals, perhaps, and this is the stretch part, are a little bit carried over. But hysteresis has a dual side. We get down to the bottom, and now it's a little more sluggish going up. It's resisting. It doesn't want to follow the ideal curve. The actual is the dotted purple line there in the upper right hand. The ideal is the red. And it's saying, oh, you know, and this, look at this situation we're in. We're 305 years, 306 years into this electrical age, as it's called in the Vedic texts. And we're still burning coal to generate electricity, but we're still burning coal. It's interesting, we're still using a transition stage technology because it's kind of comfortable. You know, we all talk about alternate energy, but, you know, I'm driving a hybrid, folks, so there's been some improvement. But, you know, so you think about the implication. Now, what about this Barkhausen effect? Well, you go over here. Basically, if you actually look at the magnetization that occurs in a material, it does not happen smoothly. It happens in discrete steps, discovered by a guy named Barkhausen. Think about what the implications are of that. We go along, this field is kind of building things up, but the population isn't really responding to it, and then all of a sudden a bunch of people flip into alignment with, you might say, the new order, the new state of things. And what happens? All of a sudden we have a revolution, or we have a fad, or we have a bunch of people deciding they're not going to put up with it anymore. And that may be an indication of something that is related to 2012. Maybe at 2012, a very substantial one of those events is about to occur where we get through a kind of a critical, you might say, we cross a nonlinear threshold and whang, we're up in this now, a bunch of this high response region. And finally down here, we have the idea, this one's kind of hard to see, but they talk about in the Vedic text and in some of the others they allude to it, that there are these grander cycles. And that our cycle is actually the little wiggles, the little red wiggles riding up and down on this much slower wave, which involves hundreds of thousands of years. That's another possibility for 2012, because in one of the descriptions of these ancient ages, it says we're actually at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom. Three of the cycles kind of more or less hit the bottom at the same time, so perhaps that other one is starting to hit its inflection point. That's, at any rate, it's food for thought. The point is that, interestingly enough, some of the human behavior kind of looks like magnetism. So anyway, what can I say? I'm going to go through this part really quickly because I'm coming up on my time limit here. And, oh, yes, let's go back to this very quickly. All right. Electromagnetism. Let's see. I may have some of my slides out of order here, so you're going to have this is worth talking about. What are some candidates for the grand center? Well, the galactic core, which is the picture on the right-hand side, these are just standard astronomy texts. It's possible that we might be dealing with something like the galactic core certainly is a grand center of rotation. But I think actually it's the grand center. There is probably a more local center. If you are interested in tornadoes, you know, if you've seen all those wonderful documentaries about tornadoes on the Discovery Channel and all that stuff. I used to do storm chasing. It's a really interesting thing. And by the way, nothing in this world will take your mind off your problems like seeing one of those things coming at you, because it is not, you know, it's but if you look at the big tornadoes, they have these what are called suction vortices, you know, where there'll be a quarter-mile wide funnel, and then there'll be three. It's always in odd numbers too. It's always three. Well, actually, it'll go 2 and then 3 and then 5. But suction vortices that orbit around the outside, and these are really what do the damage. And so I suspect that when the ancients talk about the local grand center, and one of their candidates, by the way, for that is the Pleiades, that might be a local center of this very intense rotation. So you could think of a big whirlpool with a bunch of little whirlpools out on the perimeter. Our galaxy is the big whirlpool, and locally we're in one of those. And the 2012 date may have to do something with the interaction dynamics between the rare time when basically our little whirlpool lines up, and then there's this coincidental alignment with the grand, all the major centers of rotation basically come into alignment. And if that's true, and if you buy into some of this stuff that we've been trying to talk about, 2012 could be significant. It looks like it could be. I was kind of resisting that for a while, but I'm starting to think, you know what? It looks like that might actually be kind of a big bump in the road. So you heard it here. And the Pleiades actually is a very interesting star system because actually it's got white dwarfs mixed in it, and to make a long story short, it's supposed to be young stars, but it's got these old burned out cinder type stars in it, and so it may have been around for quite a bit longer. Those of you that are really more into having read the ancient text, you'll know what the problem is that the grand center is supposed to have been around for quite a while, and if the stars are only like 100 million years old, which is typical age for those younger hot blue stars, it's kind of hard to see how that would work, but at any rate, the galactic core, I simply will tell you that at this point, the candidate that I'm interested in is basically going to be whatever shows up with an experiment that I've got in mind. I think that we should basically follow experimental evidence. The ancients can give us some great guidelines, but remember, a lot of that stuff was corrupted during the Dark Ages. And I'm going to talk kind of lastly a little bit about this universal magnetism and something that I did, and I've got just enough time to do it. One of the questions that's going to come up is, wait a second, how can we be in an orbit with Sirius, because it's really pretty far away, and gravity falls off as 1 over r squared. And how can we have an influence from something as far away as the Pleiades, because that's really quite a distance. 430 light years, I think, is one estimate. Well, here's our orbit again, and here's an experiment we did. And this experiment I'm not even doing justice to. This does not look like what the device looked like. We built a device that explored what happens when you have an electric current flowing down a cylindrical transmission line structure that is basically diverges on one end, converges on the other, and it is in a system that is a balance, and it is then inside of a fully electrostatically shielded enclosure, and then inside of 2 8-foot diameter Helmholtz coils to null out the Earth's magnetic field, vibration damped, wind current damped, and acoustic damped. And what we found is it gets a little lighter on the diverging end, a little heavier. That's a prediction that comes out of the old Einstein asymmetric unified field theories, of which I'm a proponent. And it also says, what we found out in working through the math is that if you have the sun, a star, and it is producing a diverging current, it actually can modify the gravity. So think of the solar wind. The gravity will have stability zones are in it. And it'll be 1 over r squared, but there's like what we call in physics a Bessel function. It's a kind of a oscillatory function that shows up. It comes out of mechanical engineering and electrical engineering a lot that modifies it. And what I'm proposing is the reason we're bound is that this is actually what accounts for the modified gravity. If you plot this Bessel distribution around our sun, turns out it predicts the orbital locations of all the planets far better than Bode's law. If you take this Bessel distribution, and if it is really operating, modifying gravity, it would suggest that you could have 2 stars that are further apart than 2 other stars, but there actually is a kind of a stability zone where they're going to feel a little bit more of a binding force, and potentially also for the mental mind-boosting effects of the Pleiades, that same type of thing could occur. This is very speculative. This work was published, not the speculation about the great year part. And that's not why we did this. We did this because I'm one of those nuts that believes we'll be able to control gravity through electromagnetism eventually, like the Germans were working on in World War II, which I'm not supposed to say. But at any rate, so that actually it was the motivation for that experiment. And I guess I've got 1 more minute here. The ancients, in my opinion, understood the physics. And I will try to skip. One last chart. We know of 4 fundamental forces in physics today. The 2 nuclear fields, strong and weak, electromagnetism and gravity. The ancients described 5. I've been going through and doing a comparison. What's quite amazing is the ancients link it more, they describe it more in terms of electricities, as if there's different types of current. And 2 weird things keep showing up. In some cases, their description of these electricities sounds like the ons from solid-state physics. If any of you are physics majors, you'll run into these, the plasmon and the polariton and the magnon, all these weird ways that energy transports through crystals. And on the other hand, it does sound a little bit like it's talking about the fundamental forces. They mentioned that one of the forces, Prithvi, is able to distinguish particles and separates them into angular classes, and that sounds a little bit like the electroweak, or the weak aspect of the electroweak force, and one is always a contracting force and the other has a repulsive core but also an attractive nature, which sounds a bit like the strong force. That's from a very ancient text. And that right there is a remarkable corollary with just even to have a thought about the physical world, that it would behave that way, that there would be these underlying forces that basically have these kind of distinct characteristics. So with that, I'm not going to go into some of the stuff about the ancient structures. If I'm back here next year to talk, I'm going to try to talk at that time perhaps a little bit more about some ideas I've got going on with ancient electromagnetic engineering. But I think I'm actually over my time limit, and I want to thank you. You've been a great audience.